Everybody, welcome in. We're gonna take a minute or two to let everybody trickle on in here, so bear with me. Um, we will also be bringing up a poll, which I think you can see as you join. So go ahead and fill that on out as you get a chance, just to kind of give you something to do while we let everybody in. The questions are going to be about where you're at in your EV charging journey. If you have a charging station, how often are you seeing reports or discussions around reliability? How are you measuring the difference between uptime and SCAR? If you don't know what those mean, feel free to select C on that one. Is your station reliability currently measured on a per port or per station basis? And finally, what is your role? Who are you? So feel free to answer those as we let people in here for probably another 30 seconds to a minute. Again, where are you at in your journey? How often are you seeing reports on reliability? What is the difference between uptime and SCAR, and how are you measuring that? Is your station reliability measured on a per port or per station basis? And what is your role? Awesome. So it looks like we're still growing attendance, so let me just give it a couple more seconds.
And we'll keep the poll. We can keep the poll rolling throughout this, Quincy, and let people fill it out as they join later too.
Great. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Looks like we got a good showing. So thanks for being here with us. It's a pleasure to see you all again. Today we're going to be having a pretty exciting and compelling webinar about what I would consider the root of all value for the entire EV charging industry. So this is a very important conversation. So don't be confused by the technicalities or the jargon that we're going to be talking about today. Reliability is truly the root of all value for the EV charging industry. So we're going to learn a lot about that today. I also will mention this is the first of a two-part webinar series. So you're coming once, you're getting twice the action. So please note that there will be another webinar with as a second half of this in April. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Okay, great. So kicking it off here, we'll be covering the following agenda today, starting with an introduction from our amazing panelists. And we'll be going into what true reliability is, with a little bit of a technical deep dive, and then talking about how that really anchors the driver to your location and how that builds trust with the driver and how that ultimately builds usage and loyalty and, most importantly, value. And then we have some exciting discussions around the latest from the NEVI situation. Obviously, that's top of mind for everybody, so we want to make sure we give a little bit of voice to that. And then finally, there's a Q&A. There's going to be an audience Q&A. So go ahead and leave your questions for the panelists or myself in the Q&A chat, and we will be answering those. Great. Okay, cool. Well, let's kick it over to the next section in this, which is who the speakers are. Who are you talking with today? So if you don't know, my name is Quincy. I'm the CEO of Electric Era. Our company builds EV fast charging stations for retailers that are electrifying and modernizing their car refill services for drivers. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Kameale?
Hi, my name is Kameale. I am the co-founder and CEO over at ChargerHelp. We're focused on uptime and reliability, and I'm excited to share almost my 10 years of knowledge now in this little EV charging space. So super excited to be here. I'll pass it over to Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Kameale. I'm losing my voice, so I apologize. But Chris Kaiser, a VP of Business Operations at Sona Energy Solutions. I also lead our EV charging efforts. So at Sona, we design, install, and operate both fast charging stations and level 2 for fleets, multifamily, or the retail environment.
Awesome. And I'm Sith Dharmasiri. I'm joining Quincy here at Electric Era. I'm the VP of Software Engineering. I'm responsible for our current generation of product and operations of our charging stations out in the field. So I'm super excited to be joining here everybody today and talking about reliability.
Awesome. Thank you all. So we got a jam-packed crew here today, decades of combined experience. Kameale, shout out to you for such a long track record of success in this industry, and really excited to pull your insights out today. All right, let's jump into the next section here. So just kicking us off, again, I mentioned this at the top of the order, but reliability is truly the kind of bedrock or root of all value for the entire industry. And that's simply because without reliability, the driver trust breaks down and they won't go to your charging station. So in order to get drivers to the store or to your charging station, you have to have a good experience. It has to be reliable. And furthermore, it has to be reliable continuously. Drivers really want to have continuous coverage for their life. They want to build trust for where they choose to fill up their car. And the only way to do that is to have a reliable experience that's convenient and easy for them each and every time. And over time, as you build up rapport and trust with them, you gain more and more loyalty. And that ultimately leads drivers back to your establishment. So it really all starts with reliability. And underneath that is all getting on the same page around kind of what the clear measurements of reliability are. This is how, we focus the conversation on what we should be improving every day internally at Electric Era and at the companies for the other panelists. And then the second item is transparency of data. So after you know what you should be focusing on, the next big important step is improving it every day and accessing data that gives you insights as to how it's performing every day. So that's predominantly what we're going to be talking about today. Let's kick it off with kind of the key performance indicators for reliability, right? These are the main things that you should leave this webinar with in your mind, really going away from this, giving yourself 3 easy things to focus on. First and foremost, let's start off with per port and per station measurements and kick it over, Chris, to you and give your thoughts on this very important KPI for reliability.
Yeah, perfect. And thanks for kicking it off. And you kind of touched on some of the concepts I wanted to go over, where when we talk about reliability, I think people often think the individual charging station and uptime of that station, and is the hardware working? Does the cord work? Is the station connecting to the cloud? Versus reliable, which is more of the charging site itself. Or in other words, reliability is the EV charger, reliable is the site itself. And I realize there's can be some confusion because sometimes I refer to the EV charger as the station when in reality the site is the EV charging station. But I'll try to speak reliability in terms of the EV charger, reliable as the site. And I just wanted to stress that both are obviously related and important, but the main goal is making sure that EV drivers can achieve a charge when they stop at a site to charge their car. And Quincy, you said it best, is reliable, and reliability is all about trust. And so can they stop and can they trust that their car is going to get charged at a site? And so, part of that going into the EV charger itself is looking at, okay, if there are 4 chargers at a site, the goal is to have 100% per port uptime for every single charger. But if one charger goes down, that doesn't mean the site itself goes down, because if only 3 drivers are there, there's still 3 working chargers that have a per port uptime, say, of 100%. But the goal is then to get that one charger that's down back online, because a 4th driver could pull up at any moment. So I think just holistically taking a step back and thinking about the differences in reliability for a charger versus site. Is a site reliable is important, obviously related,
Yeah.
But tracking those metrics and per port uptime feed into all of that.
Yeah, great point, Chris. And I think getting on the same page around station level versus per port level is a really core foundational insight for the whole industry. And a driver could come and as you said, half the ports could be down and the station's operational, but they're having a bad day no matter what. So moving towards high degrees of success around port uptime is really key. And also furthermore, the NEVI guidance actually specifically anchors around per port reliability. So this isn't just a matter of quantification. This is actually a matter of federal funding guidance. Sith, anything to add to what Chris said?
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris, I really liked that you touched on when the driver shows up, do they have a reliable experience? And that really kind of keys into that, like kind of the second thing you see here on that slide, which is like, are they able to successfully charge? Like even if a station is online and is up, if somebody plugs in and the session doesn't initiate, like that is still a bad experience. And in the perspective of that driver, they're not able to successfully complete their mission. And that's like one of the really kind of key demarcations of reliability, is like you can't just think about uptime, you have to think about SCAR, the successful charge attempt rate, which is we're about to dive into, I think.
Sith, why don't you break it down a little bit more and just, kind of talk through how it is actually quantified by the California Energy Commission, and what it means for the average driver?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics. If you've seen seen other people talking about it, there's other names for it. Some people call it the plug-in success rate. Some people call it the successful charge attempt rate. It all kind of means the same thing, which is, and the CEC comes up with a definition where they say, like, for a charging session initiation, like it must charge for at least 5 minutes. And they come up with a metric and they say, like, okay, like 90% of the time this has to be the case. And furthermore, they say that, this is defined per port and not per site. And all of these are really important. Like we want to make sure that when a driver plugs in, that the charging session initiates and then power is drawn. I'm really excited about the CEC's kind of definition, because it really is a big step in the right direction of ensuring that people care about this metric, and it'll fundamentally back the funding that is applied for stations that utilize this. I do want to kind of call to attention that details actually really matter when we kind of measure and like kind of come up with a KPI around session reliability, because it's kind of like easy. The devil is really in the details. Really, like, for example, like a failure to detect a session, that's still a failure. So if somebody plugs in and the charger doesn't even recognize that there's a session initiation happening, like we still want to make sure we count that when it comes to session reliability. Additionally, there's been a lot of noise in the industry about, whether or not payment failures count. The CEC actually carves this out for external payment failures. But I think that like this is another area of conversation. Payment failures count. Delivery of power is required. If you plug in and you don't actually draw any power because the charger is miscommunicating with the vehicle, that's still a failure of the session. And then finally, we also have to make sure that we're careful about carve outs for or vehicle or driver induced faults, especially because sometimes it can be hard to ascertain if in fact the vehicle or driver intended to stop a charging session. All of these things create ambiguity. And so, yeah, so I think that like these are all kind of like really important considerations in terms of how we measure session reliability.
Yeah, and Kameale, Sith made an interesting point there, which is the devil's in the details. And you at ChargerHelp have looked at 19 million details, 19 million data points in your recent analysis of the industry. Why don't you talk us through how to bring data-driven insights to these KPIs so that there's the highest fidelity look at the actual in-field performance?
No, I appreciate that, Quincy. If we could go to the next slide, I'll hop right in here. I cut my teeth on this industry being EV driver support. And so a lot of times we will have drivers give us phone calls and they're explaining an experience that we couldn't see on our back end. And so I think the most important thing that I want to ground us all in is that charging stations are computers, electric vehicles are batteries with CPUs. And so with that, with software, we know that there will be problems, right? And we also know that sometimes it's a little bit hard to detect with where we are today, but it does not mean that with more information, more transparency, and getting those details away from the devil, we can start having a more holistic experience. So what we start off with is just first looking at what is a true uptime. Because while hats off to the CEC and the work that they did around EV charging reliability, it was still a viewpoint of a network provider and what they're responsible for. And at ChargerHelp, we want to say, hey, let's take a step back and just look at, can the driver receive a charge, yes or no? And if they can't, who should be responsible? And sometimes those players are outside of the network provider. And so 3 things I want to hit on really quickly so we can keep our conversation moving. Some of the things that we looked at, and I saw somebody already put it in the chat, oftentimes we do see, because these devices are software devices, sometimes what they're stating is not always what is the experience of the driver. And we see that consistent, across our data set. We could go to the next slide here. But the thing that I want to point out, is really important is that, EV charging reliability, it's not a labor problem, right? And so just simply sending someone on site does not necessarily mean that you will solve a problem. It's a little bit more than that. But what I will say, that's very unique to the United States is that we do have a component failure problem. It's a real thing for the US. And, one of the reasons we enjoy working with Electera, and I support the work that you do, Quincy, is because of your attention to the quality of your product. But if you look at this slide specifically, in the US, we do have a lot of component failures that we're seeing, but very small electrical problems, which is sometimes a surprise for people, right? Because these are electric vehicle charging stations. But the part that I want to call your attention to is the purple and the gray part. The gray part is unknown failures. So this specifically are instances where the software provider themselves has no idea with what's going on. And we typically see that being interoperability problems. And then with the purple part, this communication software part, that's also very interesting as well. And I think that is not unique to the United States. We're seeing this overseas as well. Just next slide, please. And so, we're going to get into it a little bit later, but the report that we put out against the recommendations of my investor, I released all of my data for the last 4.5 years. And we put out this report and we said, hey, let's try to figure this stuff out. But the report's available online and we'll talk a little bit about it more. But the 5 things I just want to call to your attention is that we know that true uptime is often lower than what's reported, right? That there are software inaccuracy. And when you have software inaccuracy, it compounds reliability issues because it truly becomes a needle in a haystack. And then the other thing I'll probably just point out, just so we can keep it going, it's just this idea of how we think about operations and maintenance. It's not about just rolling a truck and getting someone on site, that you really have to utilize the data from the field to help you better understand what's happening. But most importantly, which I'll talk about later, there are specific things from a master service agreement perspective that you can require of the folks that are deploying your infrastructure. So happy to get into that. But thank you so much for just letting me lay that little bit of groundwork, Quincy.
Well, I love it. And, I would encourage everybody to go to your website and, download the report and look at the data, even against the advice of your investor. I think that's amazing that you're doing that and fully supportive of the data transparency push. Sith, when you look at this graphic, what can we do as an industry to solve these systemic issues? Like, how do you think about kind of acting on Kameale's really prescient comment around getting to a real corrective action when you look at a graph like this? What stands out to you?
A whole bunch of things, and we're definitely going to dive into some of these details. So, I won't get into all of it right here, but I see kind of a couple of key things. One is software failures and communications are all highly solvable problems, and that composes
Right.
A third of what we see here in Kameale's graph, and it that really just takes true dedicated engineering, bringing solutions from the cloud to the grid edge, which we'll definitely talk a little bit more about in detail, moving the brains of the station close to the thing that can actually make a decision about what's going wrong. And then kind of teeing into this other thing, which is literally half of this graph is about component failures and damages that we're seeing. And what that's really telling me is that, as Kameale kind of brought up, the presence of rich telemetry, the capability to diagnose what is going on and rapidly come to a root cause is absolutely key. And I think what's actually very inspiring is that there are plenty of industries that have shown that this is possible because critical infrastructure exists in so many places, which is, that always inspires me, is telling me that like this is absolutely a solvable problem. And we're not the only
Yeah.
ones facing it.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And Chris, I'm curious to get your take. I know you've had a lot of ardent opinions on the state of the industry. You've experienced it yourself. I saw a great quote from you recently that says you don't really know until you're operating your own charging stations how bad this problem is. But kind of playing off of what Sith said about solving it, what are your thoughts on, I guess, the gap in driver perception that Kameale shows here in this slide, and then B, how do we again solve it as an industry?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we have 40 minutes left, and I could take about
Only
4 hours.
only 40.
Yeah.
So
So
we'll
I'll
have
try
to be
quick,
concise. Yeah.
I think like this demonstrates an example of one of the ways to solve it is just get people who care about the issue out and talking about it. And I think all of us are active on LinkedIn and at other trade shows and in other industry groups. But I think part of the issue, if you think back, say, call it 2010 to 2020, there weren't that many charging networks available. And obviously Tesla is kind of separate because they are the best. But part of the reason is historically they've been the best because they control the vehicle and they control the charger. And that's one package. And that's why there's so many issues outside of Tesla, is because every vehicle OEM has intricacies in how their vehicles charge, and every charger OEM has different intricacies in how they charge. And everyone thinks that, oh, well, I have a charger that's OCPP and I have a backend that's OCPP and they should talk. And we'll know different backends and different chargers have to still be integrated, even though they both speak OCPP. And then the charger itself and all of that has to speak with the car. And that isn't always, a direct plug. And so it is complicated. And I think for the EV driver who's not in the industry, they don't realize all that. And
Right.
they shouldn't have to realize all that, but it's still an issue. And I think the more folks like us can get on these webinars and talk about it and explain that, hey, it's not because we in the industry don't care. We do. It's just, it really is challenging because we don't hold all their cards. Like we can't tell Ford or GM or Volkswagen Group, like we can't tell them how to build cars. All we can do is take what they give us and try to make it work. And it's really, really complicated. So I think, to shortly answer the question, it takes people who care about it, who are actually vocal about it, because, looking at that 2010 to 2020 timeframe, like we weren't doing much in EV charging at that point. I don't know when Electric Era was founded, but I'm assuming it's kind of after that. But the point is, it seems like a lot was happening in a vacuum, and that the companies that were active in the space weren't necessarily vocal or transparent in how they were approaching this issue. It was more of like, hey, let's just go get more sites in the ground, deploy. We will worry about reliability at a later date. And unfortunately,
Right.
that obviously it gave the industry a bad reputation that it still has, right? I think the number one issue people are not giving up their ICE cars and moving to EV is because of this perception that EV chargers are unreliable. And so it really is like, it's a huge issue that impacts I don't know how big the auto industry is, but it's big, right? And so we're kind of the tip of the spears, but it just takes people to care about it and talk about it. But talk is cheap, so you actually have to do something about it. So that's what we're here to do.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, there's a couple of points that y'all made that really stood out to me. One from Kameale, obviously the data shows this is a big problem. Sith's comment of, hey, we know we can solve it. It's been solved in equally complicated industries. And then Chris, your final point, which is it takes people that care, right? So kind of going back to the panelists, you folks are folks that care. Talk to us about the solutions. It's one thing to talk about problems. Let's talk about solutions that the folks on the webinar can actually implement. So why don't we kick it over to you, Sith, to maybe start us off on one of the core big problems that I think you mentioned earlier, which is connectivity. And how to solve it.
Absolutely. So yeah, and just reminding everyone, this was connectivity and software failures were kind of a third of that pie chart that Kameale was showing. And we ourselves at Electric Era have been collecting plenty of data on this ourselves, but ultimately what we found was that existing solutions in this, in the space for charging, like, really relied on cloud connectivity in order to function. When you plug in a car, it has to talk through OCPP to a cloud backend to go get authorization to charge. If you go swipe your credit card, that also goes back up to the cloud, and there's this like ping pong that happens where like one thing talks to another thing that talks to another thing that talks to another thing, and finally something says, yeah, you can charge your car now. And if at any moment during that, like, 12-step process, something decides to not communicate, or like the internet blips out for, a half a second, then what the driver is faced with is like, oh, nothing happened. Your car didn't charge. Please unplug and try again. And that's like, going back, like that hits the SCAR metric, and it should count against the charging provider, and it should encourage us to solve the problem. And what we at Electric Era ended up kind of coming up with was to, like I said before, we move the brain from the cloud all the way to the grid edge, where to the charging station itself. And we can actually enable a whole bunch of offline capabilities that don't require an active internet connection in order to actually initiate a charging session. And that comes from the form of like offline payments, as well as the actual authorization of the charging system. And overall, it just means that like we reduce our dependency on an instantaneous cloud connectivity. Of course, the cloud, it's there, it's present. We can always like go back and find out, hey, are we authorizing the right user? And we can always, come up with that determination. But at the moment of plug-in, we don't depend on it in order to actually initiate a charging session. And data has actually shown us that, like, especially some of these charging stations, they're out in the wild, like they're really out in the boonies. The data connections are not great. I know this myself as we go and do a software update and being like, oh yeah, we're only getting kilobits per second of data out there. And in some cases, we've seen as much as like 8% of transactions like actually initiate offline, and then connectivity is regained. So it's definitely a big problem, and we solve it with edge compute.
Okay, cool. Well, that was a great summary, and man, kilobits of data, that's not a lot.
No.
Yeah, more power to you for finding through all these charging stations commissionings with only that few data points. Kameale, you on the other hand have 19 million data points. So maybe why don't you break down kind of how you are thinking about solutions to the hardware reliability problem that the industry faces?
Yeah, I mean, the part that we know to be true right now is that we need more specifications in regards to the protocols that we use. And you might be like, Kameale, what does that mean? Okay.
Go on.
So here's the thing, a lot of the software that was deployed, to Chris's point, a lot of the larger players deployed software before OCPP was created. And so you might say, like, what is OCPP? It's called Open Charge Point Protocol. It was created by the Open Charge Alliance, which is a European-based organization that essentially set a set of ways to communicate for these smart assets, right? But, there's a lot of folks that created stuff beforehand. And so now we're trying to play catch up. And even what we've seen, as a company, like, there's not a lot of folks that's like Electric Era, where you guys are more like vertically integrated. There's a lot of folks that are not vertically integrated, and they have to depend on essentially these languages to properly talk to one another and understand one another. And the way that this was explained, Quincy, this might have been you. Someone told me this recently. They said that English, like OCPP is kind of like the English language, but there's different dialects. So how I might say hi might be different than someone in Boston, might be different than someone in Florida. You could take did you tell me this, Quincy?
No, but I love this analogy. Yeah.
And so I'll give it to you. But anyways, and so that's the thing with OCPP. It might say like, this is how you say hi, but like, it doesn't consider our dialects or what we're, how we're looking to do work together. And so what I've been really pushing for, because the data shows that this is a problem, is to actually get a group of CEOs together and come to, we call it the CEOs, the lawyers, and the engineers, to really come together and say like, hey, we're gonna all agree to say howdy, like whatever it is, right? And we're all agreeing to communicate in this way. But I think like that is a great first step. The other thing that I'll call out for folks that, you know, are maybe they're deploying charging stations or looking for charging partners, some of the things that you can do is really ask folks if they're OCP, you know, 1.6, 2.0, these different numbers, they mean a lot, right? And getting an understanding of what someone is actually deploying is very helpful. The other thing that I tell folks to do is to read your service level agreements. And oftentimes a service level agreement may only guide the time that a technician has to get on site. And like I told you before, just sending a human out to a station does not always mean you affix the station. So you want to ask for service level agreements for when the manufacturer will pick up the phone, a service level agreement if there's a separate network provider, when they will help troubleshoot. Really allowing for everyone to be on the same page to properly coordinate is incredibly important for the ongoing reliability. And then the last thing I'll say is that in your master service agreements, you know, we've really been pushing forward for folks to define what they expect from their hardware manufacturer, right? Post deployment, if I need a part turned around, are you promising to give me a part in 2 days, 3 days, 4 days? And if there's a cost to that, let's talk about it. But back to the devil in the details, it's so important to like spell out precisely the things that you need. And when the last thing I'll say, because I've been talking a lot now. Okay, the last thing I'll say is that you know, we're really open to collaborating with industry to start dialing out like what are those specific things. But I think what we've realized is that in our industry, you really kind of need everyone on the same page, and you need to be very specific on what people can actually do. And you folks as site hosts, you know, going to companies that are thinking about these things is incredibly important. But I'll rest my case there, Quincy.
Well, that was a great overview, and kudos to you for trying to get CEOs, lawyers, and engineers to agree on anything. That's a challenge, but a super important one. And I couldn't agree more with the value statement within that. Getting everybody on the same page, talking the same language is a key way to solve the systemic issues in this industry. Chris, you called out an interesting comment earlier, either on the webinar or in our previous conversations. You made a pretty wise observation that it's just so hard to know what is happening, you know. And I guess, you know, with that problem in mind, what maybe we could call identifying root cause, what do you see as the solutions to that super big sticking point?
Yeah, so I can use a recent case study that happened this morning. In this instance, the driver sent an issue in via an app or feedback to the charge point management system. And they said, hey, the charging cord is stuck in my vehicle. The cord is broken. And so they actually needed to get a tow, and I'm unclear why the tow was needed. But we got a video from the driver. We reached out to the driver, got a video, and the cord was indeed broken. So that's kind of a way we were monitoring using the charge point management system. So that's the first bullet point, the CPMS. On other sites, we might have cameras, or we read plug share reviews. And so we try to get feedback from as many points of data as possible, just existing operation. But taking today's example, so now we're kind of troubleshooting. Why did that cord get stuck? And was the cord broken, or did the vehicle lock the charging port on its side, and the driver went to pull it out and yanked too hard? And is there a chance that the driver broke the cord? Now, it doesn't really matter from a backward looking perspective, but from a forward looking perspective, I'm already thinking about, well, one, you know, now we have to internally escalate. So we met the driver on site. We actually had someone in the area who drove by, met up with the driver. But now our immediate action was, all right, should we push the e-stop on the station? Well, should we push the e-stop on the EV charger? Again, nomenclature. The station, there's 4 EV chargers at this one station. But I said, well, if we push the e-stop, the other port that is still working is going to go down. So why don't we just wrap the cord that is broken, wrap that in yellow caution tape, keep the EV charger itself online, but then people will know not to use that cord. So that's kind of but the next step, so that's the immediate thing. The next step is internally escalate. We have to troubleshoot, and we have to figure out what was the root cause of that issue. Was it indeed the cord, and I mean the CCS actually port, right? Was that broken? Did ice maybe get stuck under the latch? Because there's a little, on the CCS connector, there's a latch that you push down and it lifts up and you can unplug it. Did ice maybe get under that and get stuck? And or if it was indeed on the vehicle side, do we have to speak with the vehicle OEM and maybe understand that, okay, with this make and model of car on this station, so going back to station itself, and there's a CPMS and an OCPP, there's some communication between the station and the vehicle. In that communication link is something causing that particular make and model to lock its port. And it was funny because I was watching, there's a one of my colleagues or friends on LinkedIn, Anoop, has a new series where he took a Ford Lightning from Houston to the inauguration in DC. And this happened to him at an EVgo station where he couldn't get the plug out. And after an hour of customer support on that issue, he determined, oh, it was my fault, I wasn't pulling hard enough. Well, later on the way back, that same thing happened at a different charging station. I believe it was a charge point. And so then he started thinking, well, maybe this isn't a user error, or it wasn't a charging station or EV charger issue. Maybe it's a vehicle issue. And he took it to a Ford dealer, and the dealer told him, oh, there's an emergency charge port release under the hood. And he pulled that, and that was able to release the cord. So now we're on to, we've monitored, we've understood there's an issue. We're trying to troubleshoot. We're trying to figure out the internal escalation of, okay, how do we fix it? But now we're on to corrective action, right? So if I personally don't want to continue to get calls of cords getting stuck in chargers, one, because, my main concern is like the fact that someone had to call a tow truck, is horrifying to me, because that, we have two EVs. One of them's in the shop right now for a front motor failure that's getting repaired, and I just know how that has impacted our life. My wife is driving my Tesla around, and she has to bring that back, in fact, in an hour, so I could take her to the dealer and then go pick up the kids. So I know it's these EV driving issues and reliability, like, they have real world impact on people's lives, and so for me, I personally care about that. And then second, it's going to cost us money to fix this, one way or another. Like, we actually are operating these stations for the site host who owns them, but we're responsible for the operation and making sure there's uptime. So we're going to pay to get this fixed one way or another, but I don't want to have to keep paying, for new cords every month or so this happens. I want to figure out why this is happening. If it is a vehicle problem, it almost becomes way more challenging to fix because I don't have control over the vehicle. And so what we can do, and I think there's a couple of questions, I'm reading them as they come in, but it's about how drivers can communicate better with operators. And Scott Wilson asked this question. So I'm thinking, all right, is there a way within our app that if someone creates a profile and they put in their make and model of their car, can we proactively say, hey, here are the known charging issues with your car. Be sure to look out for this type of thing. Or if the CPMS indicates through an OCPP error code that the charging port is locked, can we then take that and then use some logic to say, okay, well, we know what the error code is on the hardware. We know what the make and model of the car is, and we know that this is a known issue. So can we proactively send an SMS text message or an alert through the app to say, hey, here's what's going on. We think the first step should be open your hood, and here's the instructions for your make and model, how to release the charge point latch. So that's just an example. I mean, and that's just one,
you make
go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, you made such a good point earlier, which I think will really resonate with the business leaders on the call and anybody operating a charging station, really, which is that it ultimately leads to a downstream cost. And so not only does it prevent drivers from having a great experience, it actually is a cost adder. So having good data access, access to rich telemetry and vertical integration around your solution set gets you to root cause faster and actually can prevent the problem from ever manifesting in the first place, which is ultimately better for the business case. And I think the second point you made was super prescient as well, which is the driver doesn't care. The driver is just walking around their day. They don't care about what your problems are, that it's not working. They just want to be having a great experience repeatedly. And if they do, they'll come back again and again and again, because they're going to build you into their life. People want seamless easiness and convenience. And that's I think the main thing to take away, and kind of a bridge to what we'll be talking about next, which is that if you provide the driver that seamlessness and that ease and that convenience, they're going to love you. They're going to love your stations, and they're going to come back again and again and again. And then suddenly the economics of your charging station look a lot better. So I wanted to bring it back to that point, which is, reliability is all about value. It's the link to the root of all industry, the root of all value in an industry. That's what reliability really is. So we'll be actually having a second part conversation on this in a couple months, talking about exactly that, and more importantly, how to quantify it. How do you go from reliability to revenue? How do you do that? That's pretty complicated. So let's have a conversation about it. Anything to close out with, Kameale or Sith, on this part of the agenda? I just want to keep an eye on time for Q&A for the audience.
I'll go first and kind of like really hark back to I think a key thing in kind of Chris's overall message that I think is really important, is to avoid that, like, when an issue happens, like you don't want to have any finger pointing. The presence of like both rich telemetry as well as ownership of ownership of the problem and the solution, to like actually go and dive into it and make sure that we like fix problems as well as designs is I think a really, really key thing that I want to make sure is understood and is not missed about like good approaches to reliability.
And the only thing that I guess I'll add, and it kind of goes into the next slide, Quincy, is just that I really just want to encourage folks to either, you either get a solution like a Chris or what Electric Era is doing, but just doing ad hoc hourly labor O&M contracts does not solve this problem. Right. And so really looking at entities that are offering solutions where they're not charging you by the hour, and that their essential that their North Star is the reliability of your infrastructure, whether that means rolling a truck, whether that means coordinating with other folks. It's so important to understand that just having somebody that's going to charge you a 4-hour minimum to go on site to tinker around, and they're not a part of this ecosystem, will cost you more money and more heartache than anything else. And so we consistently, like to highlight like folks like Electric Era, folks that, like Chris is saying, like Chris is telling you everything that he himself is doing to ensuring the reliability of the infrastructure that he's responsible for. But going down the pathway of having someone, if they're only offering you a parts warranty, if they're only offering you something that is concerned about an hourly rate, it is not good enough. And because I have salespeople, I would have to say, ChargerHelp, we has a reliability as a service product. People can copy it, right? And then we did it as an example for the industry to say, like, you got to be more concerned about the uptime than like nickeling and diming folks for an hourly rate.
Yeah,
that would be the one thing that I would want us to stick clear. Be able to clearly point out.
Charlie Munger has a great quote, which he says, tell me the outcome and I'll show you the incentive. So if the incentive, it's like, oh yeah, I'll charge you hourly to solve a problem. That's not going to get you anywhere, and it's fundamentally misaligned, with your business model. So I love Kameale's point there. That's awesome, Chris. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, the biggest takeaway, I'll just kind of focus on that last bullet point. I think the other ones are fairly well covered at this point. And I like what Kameale said, where, reliability as a service, or, in other conversations, we've talked about a system. And reliability truly is a system. It's not a piece of hardware. It's not a piece of software. It's not an app. It's not your service team. It's a system. And going up to the bullet point or above that, extreme ownership. I'm a big fan of Jocko Willink in the book Extreme Ownership. But who owns that system? If you're the site host and you're taking over all operations, or you're a retailer and you want to create your own charging network, that's great. Just know what you're getting into. And do you have people on staff who are going to spec the hardware, design the site, spec the CPMS, spec the communication protocols, have your service team lined up, for instance, and Kameale, you know this, or communicate better than anyone. I think traditionally people thought, oh, every time there's an issue, I got to send an electrician. Well, no, that's not true. Then with a lot of the issues, you don't need an electrician. You needed a technician. So going back to the stuff plug, At another site, we have this happen, and people push the e-stop because something's not communicated. They push the e-stop, and then they can get the plug out. Well, what that means on our end, we have to roll a truck to go just do this. It's this motion, but you have to do that. And it's all part of a system. And we're constantly thinking of like, all right, well, how do we get to the driver before they push the e-stop? Because when an e-stop is pushed, you have to physically reset it. The point is, it's a system, reliability of the system, and you need partners who view it that way. And I think everyone on this call obviously is. But just be cautious if you're looking at getting in the EV charging game. Beware of vendor-led or vendor-engineered solution, because the vendors, they're if you're just a manufacturer, they can be smooth talkers sometimes, and they can say, oh yeah, don't put this in and you're not going to have any problems. But we know that's not true. So you need partners who view reliability as a system and who are there to help ensure you maintain those uptime goals.
I want to hear from you. What's your advice for the folks on the call around all these points? I know you have spent years of your life thinking about this exact problem and how to make it better. We'd love for you to share your wisdom.
I think and this kind of like hopefully to put kind of like a bow on everything that the Chris and Kameale have brought up. Like it is everything you've heard so far. I mean, reliable charging, it's like it's a fundamentally hard problem, and this problem, you cannot blindly, like you definitely cannot just stitch solutions together. And I have done a lot of like thinking about this, looking at other industries. It's pretty crazy looking at like what happened like the 1970s around nuclear power and like 3 Mile Island and so many industries have gone through this like growth phase of trying to figure out like, oh, like, when you have to build an ultra reliable solution, you have to get all of the things that we talked about, like vertical integration, rich telemetry, deep insights into like what's going on, and continuous improvement with extreme ownership. All of this kind of adds up to ultimately help design systems that will fundamentally work at in any scenario. And and it all kind of really boils back to like especially what Chris said, and I think that's really what I really like about it. It's extreme ownership. When you're working with companies that take really extreme ownership and that right kind of like just that attitude, like it's got to work like that, like got to work like nuclear power, then that's how you end up with a successful result.
Right.
Because it is so
yeah
hard.
It's hard. I think that's step one is identify the problem, which is that it's hard. And I like what you said. It's like you got to get all the ingredients right. You have to have the rich telemetry, you got to have the vertical integration, you got to have the extreme ownership. Everything's got to come together, and you have to have that, the person that's doing that, whether it's an internal team or an external vendor, aligned with your outcome, which is to achieve high levels of reliability, high levels of uptime, etc. So we got some great Q&A questions coming in, so I do want to leave time for that. Thank you to the audience for your questions. I did want to briefly touch on the NEVI situation because I know it's a pretty interesting and hot button issue for our industry. So there's two big updates recently. So if you didn't catch them, they were on Thursday last week. The FHWA, so the Federal Highway Administration, submitted a memo basically saying that, hey, we're gonna fulfill our obligations. They said basically we're gonna pay all contracts that have been issued, and we're gonna open up another round of commentary period for new guidance on upcoming NEVI rounds. And I took those things to both be good because for the industry, because it means all the open obligations, all the open contracts, those are going to get fulfilled, and they're not, the FHWA is not shutting the door on what's to come next, the remaining rounds for NEVI. So that was on Thursday, and then I think on Friday, Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy, did an interview, and he basically said the same thing. So from the top, we have alignment on all outstanding obligations will be paid, and we're going to go through another round of guidance, interpretation, and creation to make sure that it's aligned with the new administration's priorities. So wanted to give everybody on the call the latest on that. Feel free to do some Googling if you want additional information, but there's some good guidance online about that now. Amazing. So we're getting to the end here. Let's jump into audience Q&A. Again, thank you so much for these amazing questions. Seeing a lot of good ones come in here. Let's start with a question from John Donaway. Many stations can appear available, quote unquote, but are unavailable due to things like cut cable or software glitch. How can you factor the lack of someone even being able to attempt a charge in a scenario like this into SCAR or other metrics? Sith, I know you see you're shaking your head there. It's like, Rocky Balboa getting ready for a fight. What are your thoughts on that? How do you solve that problem? And maybe we do this lightning round so we can get through a lot of these.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key is other metrics. When a cable is cut, that is per port uptime affected, and it's important for, whoever is the solution provider to be able to capture that information that a cut cable is in fact a port down, and then that is hurting their KPI until they get it resolved. And yeah, and that's like the key. You want to get really good coverage across your metrics.
Okay, so basically your answer is it's measured elsewhere and it's accounted for elsewhere, and both have to be good for the driver to have a good experience. Okay, let's do one from Lanny Hartman. Can legislation requiring 97% uptime be helpful to solve this problem, or does that end up being an expensive and ineffective way to address charging station reliability? Any policy gurus on the call? Chris, I see you waving your hand there.
I'll take a stab, because I think that 97% uptime is probably related to NEVI requirements, and I think I briefly read those, and my first thought was, well, uptime is a nebulous kind of vague term, and I like how we started with the CEC's definition of reliability, which was much more precise. And I think anytime there's a gray area or an area where the lawyers or the marketing teams can say, oh yeah, well, technically we meet the 97% uptime because it wasn't defined, that doesn't help anyone.
Right.
And I think the industry has taken advantage. So I think it was well-intentioned, but you need to be precise in your language on how things are defined so you prevent people from hiding behind smoke screens.
Okay, I love that. Yeah, so prevent the carve-outs. Let's be super transparent about what we're measuring and measure it to the letter, not the law, but rather the measure of reality. Let's measure it to the expectations of the driver, which is that it should work all the time without carve-outs. I love that. All right, let's do another one. This is a pretty interesting one. So Arwen Gautam, when one port fails, the reliability of other ports within the station decreases as their usage increases. So basically, reliability of the other ports can go down as well. How do you? Where did this comment go? How does the station modeling and analysis capture that load sharing? Kameale, are you seeing or thinking anything about the load sharing effect of reliability knock-on effects in your work at ChargerHelp?
So, I mean, probably not the best question for us. We are more focused on all of the stations operating as intended, and strongly are against this ideal of like it's okay that one station isn't working. So I'll turn yeah.
Oh, that's a good point. I like that. It's like, hey, let's focus on the root thing. Let's get them all working and not spend time on the derivative downstream effects and thinking about them. Let's just go back to basics. Let's get them working. I love that. That's a good answer. Great answer. Okay. How do you rate when a charging session starts, but the charging speed is significantly lower? Oh, this is a hot button issue from drivers. And by the way, a lot of these are driver questions because we have a lot of drivers on the call today. Thank you for being here with us. Stith, I'm sending this one back to you, buddy. What are your thoughts on the power knockdown issue?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really big one. We actually capture this with every charging session. We pay very close attention to what the vehicle request is and whether the charger is actually meeting the vehicle request. And this is actually all monitored by our charging stations throughout the course of the entire charging session. Obviously, one of the key important things about the metric is making sure that power and energy is delivered at the start of the charging session, and that's a key thing that is captured in SCAR. But we also have to make sure that we're paying attention to the entire charging session so that like power is delivered over the course of the entire, so that you can fill up to the energy that you actually want.
Okay, so basically oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say, the other thing that we have seen as well is that sometimes during installation, stations are derated without it being public. And so in states like California, Weights and Measures is starting to do a process where it's called the RSA process. And so they're having folks go out to verify. So while sometimes it is on the vehicle battery side, we do know that sometimes folks, when they're doing when they're deploying, if something doesn't have enough capacity, they may derate stations on the back end, but then never showcase to the driver. So I know for sure that has happened in some instances. It's illegal. In California, Weights and Measures is starting to validate and verify that to help drivers. So that is a known thing in our lovely industry, but we're fixing it.
And I'll add one more.
Amazing.
I'll try to be really quick, but that's awesome because it should, like, if they're derated, they should be publicized and communicated to drivers. The other thing, though, the drivers have to understand that there's a thing called the charging curve. So just because your car was sold to you and the salesperson said, "Oh yeah, it's 180 kW peak charging," that peak might only last for a couple minutes, and then it goes and it averages out around 70 kW. So the charge curve is an important concept for EV drivers to understand. Also, outdoor temperature and battery temperature, because a cold battery is severely derated in its charging speed. So they're all super complicated issues on the charge speed.
Amazing. Okay, cool. And just as a note on that last comment, most OEMs are starting to do battery heating, or what would be called preconditioning, to solve that problem. And Tesla has that on all of the vehicles. I think quite a few others do as well. So just one quick follow on that point. All right, here's maybe one final question. We probably got two more. So what are the challenges? Excuse me. What are the challenges for OEMs/designers in considering reliability in the product development process itself? So how do you, when you're developing a charging station product or a charging station product, how do you incorporate these considerations to make sure that they're achievable when the station launches? Sith, why don't you give us the perspective from where you sit?
Yeah, absolutely. Ultimately, there's two aspects to it. The first is adherence to a specification. The more you adhere to a specification, and the less you stray, like the more likely it is that, like, when things communicate, that they communicate well. Obviously, the reality is that there's going to be variance in that. And so especially as a charging station designer, it comes from like exhaustive testing across, many different OEMs and collecting data, especially when you test, to understand like why different vehicles behave in different ways, and that will really help kind of like solve problems like interoperability. And this actually extends to everything else about the charging station stack. Understanding how things behave over temperature, and like other extensive environmental conditions all play into kind of designing reliable products.
Very cool. And I think you kind of hit it there, the last point you made there, but with hardware, it's also a lot of tests. So testing the hardware, making sure before it ships out, it's gone through its entire screening test to make sure it's good. This is a great question from Mike Kozlowski. Where do you see an installation quality fitting into the reliability discussion? Any hot takers?
I will take it all the way. I
Okay,
think
let's
if
do
you
it.
are talking about reliability after something has been deployed, you're doing it wrong. We really highly, highly, highly recommend talking with folks about having a reliability partner up front, or even if you're working with the sales team at that organization, talking about reliability. Like what we often see is a huge steps that could have solved some of the problems that we see on the back end. And the last thing that I'll say to that is oftentimes too, if you are not, really budgeting for this part of reliability, or even choosing solutions that may be a little bit more expensive and not taking into consideration downtime and the cost of that, you put yourself in a really bad position.
Love it. Amazing. All right. Well, I'll maybe finish with one final one here, which is pretty great. How can EV and charging advocates be most helpful in advancing the cause? What should we be advocating for? Advocate for excellence. Take no prisoners. Demand the best. I think that's the way to do it. And You can do that by voting with your feet and going to the best reliable charging stations, leaving comments on the driver review apps, and advocating, if it pertains to legislation, advocating for no carve outs. Let's do this right, folks. All right, everybody. That's a wrap. Thank you all for attending, and it was a pleasure to have you here today. Take care, everybody.
If you're still on, you can also, I shared out the link for the next webinar. You can go to electricera.tech and find that. So it's in the chat. Thanks, guys.